Type A personalities tend to be ambitious, competitive, and aggressive. Type B personalities tend to be more patient, flexible, and laid back. Type A individuals are more prone to stress, have a sense of urgency. Type B individuals are generally more easygoing and adaptable. I'm a Type B personality, so I'm pretty easygoing and fairly dreamy. I was always called Sleepyhead when I was a kid. Probably one of my worst times was when I was playing softball and I was standing there dreaming and the ball went straight past me, which I was supposed to catch, of course. But anyway, we all know some Type A's and Type B's, and you Type A's here in the audience, you know who you are, and I'm glad for you, because if it was up to people like me, we'd probably be meeting in some rundown, unmaintained hovel. So it's good to have Type A's, and we need each other, don't we? And even though we do sometimes get annoyed at the other personality types, we need both types. And in the Bible, we've got a classic Type A and Type B picture with Mary and Martha. Martha looks like she was the one who owned the house that they lived in, and looks like she was the one that was pretty organised. And as you remember the famous story of when Jesus came for lunch with all his disciples, Martha was pretty stressed about the preparations. Mary was pretty dreamy and sitting at Jesus' feet, soaking up the teaching, and Martha got pretty annoyed. So I'm going to talk about the different way that Jesus related to both those personality types in the story of the raising of their brother Lazarus in John chapter 11. So in verse 1 of John chapter 11, we learn that Lazarus was sick, and he was from Bethany. Now, in verse 3 of John chapter 11, now I'm just thinking, I was hoping that I would bring up some verses, but I'm going to get a Bible and read it. Oh, here we go. Keep going, Ronald. Thanks, yeah. Okay, here we go. We've got the technology now. So, in John chapter 3, the sisters said, Lord, the one you love is sick. This was their prayer, basically. They were calling out in desperation to Jesus. They didn't tell him what to do. They just told him what was happening. Lord, the one you love is sick. And they'd probably waited until it was pretty desperate, because it seems like Lazarus died on the same day that they sent the messenger. And then in verse 5, right off the bat, as usual, Jesus' response is enigmatic. When Jesus is notified that Lazarus is sick, he waits 2 more days. And as it says in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister Mary and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. I don't know about you, but if I heard that a really good friend was sick and dying and I had the cure, I think I would take off straight away. So there's a couple of reasons we think Jesus did wait those 2 extra days. It gave time for the death to be really confirmed that he was dead. In those days in Israel, it was kind of a belief that when you died, for 4 days, your spirit sort of hung around, and there was a possibility that your spirit might come and you might come back to life again. But after 4 days, there was no chance and you were completely dead. So Jesus was allowing the 4 days so that it was completely certain that Lazarus was dead. And the other reason he waited was this was going to be an amazing sign for the disciples, because this was going to be a demonstration that he could bring someone back to life after they've been dead 4 days. And this was going to be very important for them in a few weeks' time, when Jesus was dead and in the tomb for 3 days. So sometimes things happen to us that are sad and frustrating. And we think, God, why didn't you answer our prayers? But this story is so comforting because it shows that there's often a bigger picture. There's often something more going on. And in verse 14, Jesus says to the disciples, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there, so that you may believe. I really like that phrase. For your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there. Jesus was definitely upset that Lazarus was dead, but he had a clear direction from God. Wait 2 more days. As you've probably noticed in the Bible, Jesus was constantly surrounded with urgent problems and crushing crowds and pressure to act. But he moved with a steady calmness and he was never rushed. And in John chapter 5, he talked about his constant dependence on God for directions. Very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing. And by myself, I can do nothing. I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me. So he was glad that he wasn't there. He'd been given the direction by God that something bigger was going to happen. So this is a really encouraging thought too, that as we spend time with God, we will listen to his direction, and we don't have to be pulled in different directions. We don't have to give in to the urgency and the stress of our culture. And the more we spend with God, we will develop that calm sense that we're doing what God wants. So now I want to bring out the 2 sisters now and the different way they reacted. So type A, Martha. She meets Jesus on the outskirts of Bethany. And when she meets him, the first thing she says is, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. So there's a little bit of saltiness in Martha's response here. She's basically saying, Jesus, if you'd come in time when I told you to come, this wouldn't have happened. I think Martha's basically saying, Jesus, you need a PA like me. You're actually late. In fact, the Message version does say you're late. But anyway, Jesus is completely non-defensive. He's totally thinking about Martha and what she needs to hear. And he knows that she's a clear-thinking, logical person. And he gives her this amazing passage in verse 25. I'm the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? Jesus cared for Martha, and he gave her an amazing truth. This is actually a very scandalous statement too. Any self-respecting Jew knew that there was a resurrection at the end of time. There's only one God. God is not a person wandering around. So if Jesus was not who he said he was, this was a shocking statement. And if he didn't rise Lazarus from the dead, they probably would have stoned him for claiming that he was God. So we're left with 2 choices with Jesus. He's either a crazy madman, a megalomaniac, or he was who he said he is. You can't say that he was just a well-loved teacher. He didn't give us that option. So anyway, back to verse 26. Jesus said, we'll never die. It's a stupendous hope. Our beautiful friend, Deborah Gill, just before she passed away, she said, don't worry about me. I'll just be in the next room where you can't see me. And that was such a beautiful statement. And then she said to Shirley and I, just before she passed away, I'll be cheering you on from the sidelines. Deborah showed us the certain hope of resurrection and the calmness and the confidence that we never die. We just go to a different room. It's such a beautiful thought. So Martha would have been happy with Jesus' response. But let's look at the way Mary responds to Jesus now. I'll pick up the story in verse 28. So after Martha had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus hadn't yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." She said exactly the same thing that Martha said. "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." But when she comes out to see Jesus, her attitude is completely different. She falls at his feet, weeping. It's interesting that the 3 times that Mary is mentioned in the Bible, she's at Jesus' feet. She's at Jesus' feet when he's teaching in Luke 10. She falls at his feet here. And in John 12, she anoints his feet with oil. So Mary, the type B emotional person, was full of devotion. She didn't care about boring things like money. She poured that expensive flask of perfume on his feet. Luckily for her, Martha was running the house and looking after the finances, or Mary probably would have ended up on the street. So we need both, don't we? But Mary is a phenomenal example of emotional and beautiful relational attitude towards Christ. So, Mary, overcome with grief, gets Jesus tears. You know, our Western culture, we're a bit obsessed with trying to minimize grief and loss, aren't we? We run from grief and we do all we can to avoid loss. But actually, it's in our time of grief and loss that's when we really experience closeness to God. So when Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Jesus breaks down and weeps with an incredible show of humility and humanity. This is the sort of Saviour we need, one who understands our pain and can weep with us. Mary didn't get theology. She didn't get a logical case or some teaching. All Jesus could do was to choke out, "Where have you laid him?" This is an incredible show that Jesus was type A and type B. He was type A, he was completely in charge of the situation, but he was type B because he could relate with Mary's grief. So Christianity is all about Jesus meeting us in our loss, our pain, our weakness, our failures. It's in these times when we're at the end of our rope that we feel those thin spaces, the closeness to heaven. I've felt this before. A few years ago, I mentioned before, but my beautiful niece Jacinta died with 3 kids. And in the days before she died, we would visit her, Shirley and I, and spend time praying and talking with her. It was a sacred time. It was a sacred space of, you really felt like heaven was close to earth. So as we get older, we realize, wow, life is fragile and life is brief. So this passage gives us a wonderful confidence and a hope. Now, twice it mentions in the story that Jesus was deeply moved. The Greek for that word is to groan or to snort with anger. It doesn't actually bring it out in our modern translations, but in the King James Version it said Jesus groaned. So he was angry at the sin and the effects of sin. He was angry at the Jews who, even though they were going to see this resurrection, they still ended up wanting to stone him. So Jesus is deeply angry at what the devil has done and how he's going to suffer, and he's going to pay that price for what the carnage of sin. So let's carry on with the story in verse 38 now. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, "by this time there's a bad odour, for he has been there 4 days." As usual, Martha is practical and thinking about the bad odour. But Jesus said, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you'll see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Jesus showed his disciples that he can raise someone from the dead, even after they've been dead for 4 days. So this is a wonderful example of how God works. He doesn't always answer our prayers in the way we'd expect. He doesn't always answer our prayers in the timing we think, but he's got bigger purposes in mind. And this is what happened here. And it's so good to think that he deals with each of us according to our personality. Jesus enters into our sorrow. He weeps with us. And this is the mystery of Christ, the man of sorrows. And it's such a beautiful story of his complete humanity and his complete divinity. There has never been a religious teacher with this power, this audacity, and this vulnerability. So, as we think about what Jesus did for us on the cross at communion, it's a beautiful picture of how he's taken the pain that sin has caused in our lives.
Wondered if there was anybody that actually wanted to. I know definitely Jesus was there comforting us and in our grief, and that thin layer between us and heaven at that point was the silver lining to that cloud space. I don't know if anybody else wants to share anything before we sing a song. We just want to move into communion and think about this wonderful person of Jesus who is there with us in our grief and who speaks to each one of us according to our needs. And also this Jesus who has the power to raise us from the place